4:11 a.m. Vinton County, Ohio. November 14, 2025. A line of black vehicles sat without headlights on a gravel service road off State Route 93. Engines off. 41 federal agents in position. The farmhouse 200 yards ahead showed no lights. No movement. The windows were covered from inside. The lead agent keyed his radio once. Twice. Confirmation down the line. Then the team moved. What the agents didn't yet know, what nobody standing in that frozen November field could have fully prepared for, was what they would find behind a false pantry wall on the ground floor and beneath a padlocked cellar hatch bolted from the outside. They had 44 days of surveillance behind them. Pole cameras mounted in the tree line. Thermal passes. A license plate reader hit from a grocery run 41 miles north. All of it pointing to this farmhouse, this property, this moment. The thread that started it all wasn't an informant. It wasn't a wiretap. It wasn't a tip from another agency. It was a meter reader named Dale Kaufman, age 53, working a rural route for a southeastern Ohio utility cooperative. A man who noticed one number that didn't fit, and then noticed it again. That number, an electricity draw that had quadrupled in a single billing cycle on a property listed as 4 adults and a storage outbuilding, would pull a thread that unraveled everything. Vinton County is one of the least populated counties in Ohio. Fewer than 13,000 residents, spread across 400 square miles of Appalachian hill country. Farmhouses sitting back from paved roads. Properties with barns, outbuildings, root cellars, old cisterns. A landscape built across generations for self-sufficiency and privacy. It is the kind of geography where unusual things can stay unusual for a very long time. The farmhouse on Ridgeline Fork Road sat on 11 acres. County deed records listed 4 occupants, 2 adults in their 40s and 2 in their 60s. The property had been owned by the same extended family for over 3 decades. The older couple had lived there since the 90s. No criminal record on file for any of the 4. Property taxes current. No outstanding warrants. From the road, nothing visible except an overgrown lawn, wood plank siding gone gray with age, and curtained windows on every elevation. The county assessor's map labeled the eastern half of the structure as storage. It was not storage. Dale Kaufman drove the same rural route on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. He had worked that route for 11 years. He knew the properties the way a mail carrier knows a neighborhood, not the people inside, but the rhythms. Which farms burned lights late? Which went dark in winter? Which drew power for heat tape on pipes or for an extra chest freezer in the barn? The Ridgeline Fork property had always been low draw. 4 adults, older construction with baseboard heat. Consistent. Seasonal variation within a predictable band. When Kaufman pulled the October 2025 read on his handheld unit, the number stopped him. The draw had gone up by a factor of 4 since the July cycle. Not a gradual increase. A sharp jump and then a sustained plateau at the new level. He noted it in his log and flagged it for his supervisor as a possible meter malfunction or unauthorized line tap. That would have been the end of it, an internal utility matter, probably explained away, except that when the cooperative dispatched a field tech to investigate, nobody answered the door. Not that visit. Not the one 3 weeks later. Not the 3rd attempt in early November. The property showed signs of occupancy. A vehicle in the driveway. A light visible through the gap in the curtains on the 2nd visit. But no answer. No engagement. The posted utility access notice went unanswered. The supervisor escalated the unresolved access issue to local county authorities. The county passed it to the Ohio State Highway Patrol. A patrol officer noted the address, ran it through standard databases, found nothing of immediate concern, and filed a routine welfare check referral. That referral landed in the inbox of an investigator at the Columbus resident agency of the FBI's Cincinnati Field Division, Special Agent Karen Melick, who handled rural welfare and missing persons casework across 5 southeastern Ohio counties. Melick pulled the referral on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November. She almost set it aside. A utility access dispute with no criminal indicators. A rural family that didn't want to talk to the power company. It was not the most unusual thing in Vinton County. What made her look twice was something in the access log the cooperative had attached. The field tech's third visit, late October, had noted one additional detail in his field notes: a sound. He had written it down almost as an afterthought, the way people note things they don't know how to categorize. He had heard sounds from inside the structure. He had described them as continuous and low. He had assumed it was a television or radio left on. Melick read that line 3 times. She spent an hour going through the case file. The elevated draw. The non-responsiveness. The sounds. None of it, individually, cleared any evidentiary threshold. But stacked together, the profile matched something she had seen flagged in a federal pattern brief circulated by the Homeland Security Investigations Field Office in Columbus 8 months earlier. Utility anomalies associated with concealed occupancy operations in rural residential structures across the Appalachian Corridor. She called the HSI office the same afternoon. What's most surprising about this case isn't the sophistication of what was eventually found on the property. It's how close the thread came to never being pulled at all. Kaufman almost didn't flag the meter reading. He told investigators later that he had debated it, wondering if the numbers were simply a meter error. The field tech's notation about sounds in the structure was made in a personal field notebook, not in the official utility form. It was attached to the complaint packet only because the supervisor had asked for all supporting notes. One link in a chain of bureaucratic decisions. Any one of them breaks, and the file closes. The HSI investigator assigned to the joint inquiry was Special Agent Directive Liaison Thomas Yarrow, a 12-year veteran of HSI's Child Exploitation Investigations Unit who had been transferred to the Columbus office 18 months prior. Yarrow reviewed Melick's summary within 24 hours of her call. He had 2 immediate questions. How many people were drawing that kind of sustained power? And why was the county assessor listing half the structure as storage? Yarrow pulled county building permits going back 15 years. The original farmhouse footprint matched the current deed. But a permit filed in 2016 listed a renovation project, interior partition construction on the ground floor, described as a pantry and utility reconfiguration. The contractor on the permit was a sole proprietor whose license had lapsed in 2018. The permit had been signed off without a follow-up inspection. A partition wall built in 2016. Never inspected. Yarrow put in a formal surveillance authorization request to the Cincinnati Field Division the same week. The authorization came back approved on November 1, 2025. A joint FBI-HSI task force. The operational name assigned to the file, Operation Ridgeline. The surveillance package was standard for a Tier 2 rural operation. Pole-mounted cameras positioned in the tree line along the county road, focused on the driveway, the front porch, and the visible eastern outbuilding. A license plate reader placed on a utility pole 2 miles south on State Route 93, covering the primary vehicle access route. Night vision and thermal imaging capability assigned for aerial overwatch, to be deployed on request from the ground coordinator. The task force also pulled cell tower data for the property's grid. 4 active devices registering in the sector, consistent with 4 adult occupants. But the aggregate data on the devices showed an unusual pattern. None of the 4 numbers placed or received calls outside a very narrow contact list. No social media registration linked to the numbers. No food delivery services. No streaming subscriptions billed to the associated accounts. For a property where 4 adults lived, The digital footprint was smaller than the footprint of a single elderly person living alone. 3 weeks of poll camera footage produced a behavioral profile. The property was not inactive. Vehicles left and returned on a rough schedule, primarily early morning and late evening. Grocery and supply runs averaged once every 8 to 11 days. Destinations were never closer than 35 miles from the property: Chillicothe to the north, Gallipolis to the south, Logan to the east. Never local. Never the same store 2 consecutive trips. The supply volumes were inconsistent with 4 adults. The bags and containers loaded from store parking lots, visible in enhanced surveillance footage, were consistent with provisioning for a significantly larger group. The plate reader logged a hit on November 9th, one of the 2 registered vehicles on the property captured northbound on State Route 93 at 6:14 a.m. The destination, tracked by aerial asset handoff, was a Chillicothe wholesale grocery distributor. The cargo loaded into the vehicle from the distributor's loading dock, bulk dry goods. Cases of product. The quantity, documented by HSI commercial records subpoena to the distributor, was 340 pounds of foodstuffs in a single purchase. 4 adults. 340 pounds of food in one run, 8 days after a previous documented supply trip of comparable scale. Yarrow submitted the thermal imaging request to the Cincinnati Field Division on November 10th. The aerial pass came in at 2:17 a.m. on November 11th, a moonless night, cloud cover at 60%. The aircraft flew a standard agricultural survey pattern, a routine cover for thermal work in rural areas, and the imaging system swept the Ridgeline Fork property in a single pass, lasting approximately 40 seconds. The results came back to Yarrow's terminal at 7:48 the following morning. The county assessor listed the eastern portion of the ground floor as storage. The thermal imaging showed 16 distinct heat signatures in that space. 16. Yarrow sat with that number for a long time. The image resolution didn't allow for precise characterization, but the signatures were human scale. They were distributed in what the thermal analyst described as a clustered pattern consistent with sleeping bodies in close proximity. The spacing and distribution suggested bunk-style arrangement. The thermal output of the room as a whole was elevated, significantly warmer than the ambient nighttime temperature outside, and warmer than the main residential portion of the structure, consistent with a large number of bodies in an enclosed, poorly ventilated space. The electrical draw. Now explained. Space heating and ventilation systems running continuously to support a much larger population than the deed listed. Yarrow called Melick at 8:15 a.m. There's a line in the thermal analyst's report that reads almost like something out of a technical manual rather than a document describing a human situation. It says, simply, signature count 16. Distribution, consistent with occupied residential use. Confidence interval, high. Bureaucratic language. Clinical framing. But behind those words was the recognition that 16 people, not 4, not 6, but 16, were living in a space the county had categorized as storage. The task force immediately escalated to a Priority 1 joint operation. The Cincinnati Field Division activated its SWAT element. HSI Columbus tasked its Child Rescue Team, a specialized unit with training in victim extraction from confined and traumatic environments. Ohio State Highway Patrol was brought in for perimeter support. A staging area was established behind a decommissioned agricultural cooperative building 4.3 miles from the property. The command structure required a search warrant before entry. Yarrow and Melick worked with the assigned federal prosecutor through the night of November 11th. The affidavit ran to 62 pages. It laid out the utility anomaly, the surveillance observations, the supply volume discrepancy, the cellular pattern analysis, the thermal imaging results, and the structural permit history pointing to the false partition wall. The warrant was signed by a federal magistrate at 11:52 p.m. on November 13, 2025. Execution was set for 4:11 a.m., November 14th. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. For 44 days, a property holding 16 people in a sealed space had sat undetected in a county with a sheriff's department, a state police presence, and a functioning utility infrastructure. The mechanism wasn't invisibility. It was routine. The 4 adults on the deed paid their bills, kept a low profile, drove ordinary vehicles at ordinary hours, bought food from stores 40 miles away. The concealment strategy was built entirely on the assumption that nobody would look closely enough to add up the numbers. They were almost right. The SWAT element from the Cincinnati Field Division was composed of 14 agents in full tactical configuration. They staged in 3 vehicles on the service road, engines cold, from 2:45 a.m. The temperature that night was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 11 miles per hour. The field coordinator monitored a live thermal feed from a fixed aerial asset positioned 2 miles out, confirming the heat signatures in the eastern portion of the structure remained static, occupants still in position, no indication of alert or movement. The HSI Child Rescue Team, 6 agents plus a K-9 unit and a ballistic shield operator, staged separately at the barn's north face, positioned to move directly on the cellar hatch once the perimeter was secured. The team lead carried a bolt cutter rated for the padlock gauge identified in aerial photography. She also carried a trauma kit and a stack of thermal blankets. 2 Ohio State Highway Patrol units sat at the property line on Ridgeline Fork Road, blocking both approach vectors. A medical staging tent had been erected behind the barn, out of sightline from the house, staffed by a 3-person EMT unit from the County Emergency Services Office and a crisis intervention specialist from HSI's Victim Services Division. At 4:11 a.m., the field coordinator gave the execute order. The SWAT element moved from the service road to the front porch in just under 90 seconds. Noise discipline. Single file. The porch steps were bypassed using a portable platform to avoid the creak of aged wood. The tactical planners had identified that as a potential alert risk from surveillance footage showing one of the adult residents reacting to ordinary porch sounds during prior visits. The breaching team hit the front door at 4:12 and 40 seconds. Ram on the deadbolt. The door came open on the second impact. 30 seconds into the breach, agents had cleared the main floor living space and were moving toward the kitchen. The pantry wall, a floor-to-ceiling installation with shelving units affixed, was identified immediately. The shelving was real. Canned goods, dry goods, storage containers. But the gap at the lower right corner, visible only from a specific angle at floor level, revealed a hinge mechanism. The wall swung inward. What was behind it was not a pantry. It was a passageway, approximately 4 feet wide, leading to the eastern section of the structure, the section the county assessor had called storage. The section the thermal imaging had shown holding 16 heat signatures. The lead SWAT agent moved into the passageway first, flashlight forward, and cleared it in 4 seconds. He came out and said 2 words into his radio. Medical. Now. Meanwhile, the HSI team had reached the cellar hatch on the exterior of the structure. The hatch was padlocked from the outside, a detail visible in aerial photography and confirmed in the warrant affidavit. The bolt cutter opened it in one motion. The K-9 handler held the dog on a short lead, reading the animal's response. The dog indicated immediately on the open hatch. The cellar was empty. It had been used recently. The K-9 indicated on scent, but the space itself held no current occupants. Whatever its prior function, everyone in the structure was now in the eastern section, accessed through the false pantry wall. At 4:17 a.m., the 4 adult residents of the property, a man and woman aged 41 and 44, and a man and woman aged 62 and 67, were taken into custody in the driveway without incident. All 4 were cooperative. None attempted to flee. None spoke to agents beyond confirming their identities. They were placed in separate custody vehicles and transported to the Vinton County Sheriff's Facility for federal processing. At 4:22 a.m., the first child was walked out of the farmhouse through the front door. The HSI child rescue team worked systematically through the eastern section of the structure over the next 23 minutes. The space contained 4 rooms, 2 large and 2 small, each fitted with bunk-style sleeping arrangements constructed from rough lumber. The walls were bare concrete block. There was no working plumbing in the eastern section. There was a space heater unit in each room, explaining the elevated thermal signature. There was a single bare bulb on a pull chain in the ceiling of each room. There were no windows. The space had been sealed. The sworn affidavit that would later be made public after the indictment unsealed described the conditions in clinical, measured language. The investigators' field notes, reviewed by the federal prosecutor during warrant preparation, used different language. One agent's notes, entered into evidence, used the phrase "almost feral" to describe the state in which the occupants were found, a phrase that would appear in the press summary of the indictment and become the line most associated with the case. What that phrase meant, in clinical terms, was this: 16 individuals in a confined space with no natural light, no working plumbing, severely restricted movement, and limited social contact with the outside world for an extended period, display behavioral and physiological signs consistent with profound deprivation. They may not respond to verbal commands in expected ways. They may not recognize standard social cues. They may react to light, sound, and open space in ways that require trained de-escalation. The child rescue team had trained for exactly this. They moved slowly. They used low voices. They carried the thermal blankets and kept the flashlight beams angled down. One by one, they walked out of the farmhouse into the cold November pre-dawn air and across the frost-hardened ground to the staging tent behind the barn. It took 23 minutes to account for all 16. At 4:45 a.m., the field coordinator transmitted to the Cincinnati Field Division Command Post, all subjects recovered, all subjects receiving medical assessment, 4 individuals in custody, site secure. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. And it's worth sitting with. The federal prosecutor filed charges against all 4 individuals within 72 hours of the arrest. The charges, filed in the Southern District of Ohio, included conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment, multiple counts of unlawful detention of persons, and related federal charges carrying substantial mandatory minimum sentencing ranges. The sealed indictment, prepared before the raid and unsealed the morning after, had been in preparation for 9 days, drafted as soon as the thermal imaging results confirmed the occupancy count. The 2 younger adults, the man and woman aged 41 and 44, were identified as the primary operational managers of the arrangement inside the house. The 2 older adults, the man and woman aged 62 and 67, were the long-term property owners whose deed made the concealment possible. The federal prosecutor's theory of the case held all 4 equally culpable in a joint enterprise sustained over a period the prosecution would argue began substantially before the 44-day surveillance window the task force had observed. How long before? That was the question the investigation hadn't yet answered on the morning of the raid. And the answer, when it emerged through the subsequent forensic analysis of the property, was significantly longer than anyone in the task force had anticipated. What this case tells us about a certain kind of concealment is uncomfortable. It doesn't require sophisticated infrastructure. It doesn't require corrupt officials or complicit institutions. It requires only a property with the right layout, a pattern of behavior calibrated to appear ordinary, and the reasonable expectation that no single observer will ever accumulate enough data points to connect the picture. The Ridgeline Fork property functioned for as long as it did not because the system failed, but because the system was never designed to catch something that looked, from every individual angle, like nothing at all. The thread that unraveled it was 1 meter reading. One utility employee who wrote down a number that didn't fit. Here's the take that will probably draw argument. The 44-day surveillance window before the raid, given what the thermal imaging showed on the first pass, was too long. Once 16 heat signatures appeared in a space documented as storage, the legal standard for emergency entry should have been met. The decision to build a more comprehensive evidentiary package, however professionally justified by the investigators involved, added weeks to a timeline that those 16 people experienced in real time. Federal operational protocol prioritized case integrity. That is a legitimate institutional choice. It is also a choice with a human cost that the formal record tends not to enumerate. 14 days after the raid, a forensic team completed the structural analysis of the false pantry wall and the cellar space. Their findings extended the timeline considerably. Physical evidence in the cellar, residue patterns, wear marks, chemical traces, was consistent with the space having been used in its current configuration for a period the forensic chemist estimated at between 14 and 22 months. Not 44 days. Not even 6 months. The investigation had arrived at the 44-day window because that was when the utility anomaly surfaced. But the anomaly itself was new. Prior to the October billing cycle, the electrical draw on the property had been managed differently, apparently using a secondary panel the task force forensic team found hidden in the barn's utility closet, wired to bypass the main meter. Something had changed in late summer or early fall that caused the operators to shift their power routing in a way that suddenly made the anomaly visible to Dale Kaufman's meter reader. What changed? The secondary panel had failed. A component burnout, visible in the forensic inspection. The operators had lost their bypass and shifted load to the primary meter. And that shift, a mechanical failure in a hidden electrical panel inside a barn, is what put the quadrupled number on Kaufman's handheld reader in October. Not a crack in the operations discipline. A broken circuit board. One broken circuit board in a concealed electrical panel changed the number on a meter reader's scanner by a factor of 4. That number went to a supervisor. That supervisor sent a technician. That technician wrote a note about sounds. That note landed in Melik's inbox. Melik called Yarrow. Yarrow requested thermal imaging. And 44 days after that first read, 16 people walked out of a sealed space into a staging tent behind a barn in Vinton County, Ohio. One detail that stuck with me going through the operational file: Dale Kaufman's name appears exactly once in the formal record, in a single footnote to the investigative chronology section of the affidavit. He is identified as a utility company field employee who flagged an anomalous meter reading. That is the entirety of his documented role. The chain of consequence that follows from that one flagged reading runs to 62 pages of sworn affidavit, 4 arrests, a federal indictment, and 16 people receiving medical care in a county emergency tent. His name, 1 footnote. The 4 defendants appeared for an initial federal hearing in Columbus on November 17, 2025. All 4 entered not guilty pleas through appointed counsel. Federal pretrial detention was granted for all 4 on the prosecution's motion, the court finding by clear and convincing evidence that no conditions of release would reasonably assure the safety of the community or the appearance of the defendants. The federal prosecutor's office continued the investigation after the arrests. The specific scope of the operation, how the arrangement had been organized, whether the 4 individuals on the deed were the only parties involved, whether any financial transactions connected the property to networks operating outside Vinton County, remained open questions in the months following the raid. One line of inquiry that the investigative file flagged but did not resolve by the time the indictment unsealed: communications data from the 4 cell devices registered at the property showed a pattern of contacts over the prior 18 months, with at least 2 numbers registered to devices in a different state. Those numbers had gone inactive within 48 hours of the raid. Their associated devices were never located. The identities of the individuals using those numbers remained unconfirmed as of the date the indictment became public. The network, in other words, may not have ended at the Ridgeline Fork property line. The forensic team's estimate of 14 to 22 months of active use of the concealed space in its current configuration was never reconciled against the 4 defendants' accounts, since all 4 declined to speak to investigators. What happened on that property before the 44-day window the task force observed? Who else may have been held there? How many people passed through? What the full duration of the operation actually was, remains a gap in the record. Money recovered at the time of the arrest, approximately $12,000 in cash, found in the primary residential section of the house. Financial subpoenas issued to the 4 defendants' associated accounts revealed several additional thousands in deposits over the prior 2 years. The prosecution's theory required a financial beneficiary receiving payments that funded the operation. That beneficiary, whoever was on the other end of those 2 unregistered phone numbers, was never charged. The cell network is dismantled. The 2 numbers it connected to are gone. The devices that carried them were never found. The 16 people recovered from the Ridgeline Fork farmhouse received immediate medical evaluation at the staging tent and were transported to 2 county hospitals for further assessment. The hospital intake records, sealed by court order, are not part of the public file. The formal record states only that all 16 were evaluated and received appropriate medical care. Length of stay and nature of treatment are not documented in the publicly accessible portions of the case file. The 4 defendants remained in federal pretrial detention as the case moved toward trial. A trial date was set for the following year. The prosecution's case, built around 62 pages of affidavit and supported by the forensic structural analysis, the thermal imaging, the surveillance record, the supply volume documentation, and the cellular pattern data, was considered strong. Whether it would establish the full scope of the operation, including who those 2 unregistered numbers belonged to and what role they played, was a question the trial would attempt to answer. Will this kind of concealed occupancy operation in rural residential structures surface again in the coming years? Comment yes or no, because the investigative file raises a possibility that nobody involved in Operation Ridgeline treated as hypothetical. The property at Ridgeline Fork Road was one address. The HSI pattern brief that Mellick had seen 8 months before the raid, the one that flagged utility anomalies associated with concealed occupancy in rural Appalachian structures, had been compiled from data across multiple states. It referenced not one property, not 2. It referenced a cluster. How many of those clusters still existed as of November 14, 2025, when the Vinton County operation concluded? The brief didn't say. The investigation didn't resolve it. The 2 inactive phone numbers didn't lead anywhere before the trail went cold. Dale Kaufman drove his meter route again on the 3rd Tuesday of December 2025. The Ridgeline Fork property was in federal custody by then, the access sealed with a court-ordered notice on the door. His route log for that visit noted, "Property access not required, pending federal administrative hold." He drove on. The farmhouse sat empty. Curtained windows, overgrown lawn, an outbuilding with a hidden electrical panel that had burned out sometime in late summer and sent a number to a handheld reader that didn't fit the property profile. The case is in federal court. The 2 numbers are dark. The brief sits in a database in Columbus, with its cluster notation and its open